I fixated on this movie for a lot longer than I wanted to, and I'm just gonna go ahead and get this out there, because if I don't, I feel like I'm going to lose my mind. So on May 4th, 2019, I ended up seeing Avengers Endgame, and it was incredibly frustrating. Now, before you go saying that I'm just trying to be contrarian against this movie because it's popular, let me state that there is nothing I find more frustrating than people who hate things because they're popular. And I don't really hate this movie. I found it very satisfying, especially being the end of the Infinity arc. Where I find it frustrating, though, is in its writing, and I will elaborate on that here in just a moment. But I should probably clarify, I tried as hard as I possibly could to try to explain some of this movie originally without spoiling it, but there's a lot in this movie that I can't explain without it, so if you haven't seen Endgame by this point, you might want to click away, because I'm going to be spoiling pretty much most of the movie. That's your warning. 3, 2, 1. Like I said before, I found this movie to be very entertaining and somewhat satisfying for it being the conclusion to the Infinity Saga. I like the way some character arcs ended, and I like how some characters got a lot more development, but there are a lot of other aspects about this movie that I found to be a complete waste. Seeing as this movie does a 5-year time skip, it's really neat to see some characters change in between then. One of the most dramatic changes, and one of my favorites, being Thor himself. He gains like a potbelly and everything, it's hilarious. Whereas some characters look like they've barely changed in the span of 5 years. Maybe a haircut here and there, and that's about it. And I can forgive this movie being a little bit slow at the beginning. I mean, you've got to show how a world is dealing with half of their population just disappearing out of nowhere. But at the same time, there are certain aspects that just don't make sense to me. You mean to tell me that half the population has died and there's still enough people at Epic Games to make sure Fortnite is still running even 5 years into the future? Ready Player One pulled that same thing with Overwatch, and Overwatch is barely a thing now. It was little things like that that just didn't make sense to me all that much. And I'll give the movie credit where credit is due, even though I had, again, major spoiler, Tony's death spoiled for me like crazy because the internet can't seem to help itself. The way it ended up happening still ended up having a lot of punch to it. And yeah, the funeral scene wasn't nearly as emotional as people were building it up to be, but it still had a very satisfying ending to it. And although I didn't have much interest in the overall every single movie in this series, there are a lot of callbacks that a lot of fans of the other movies will end up seeing. Of course, the ending doesn't nearly have as much impact as you think it's going to have, considering you know that they're going to be making several movies after this one, but to each their own. But that kind of covers the brief stuff I wanted to cover about this movie before I get into the crux of why this movie irritates me so much. And it all has to do with its major element of its plot: time travel. When I found out that time travel would play a major element in Endgame's plot, I ended up getting really nervous. For those that don't understand, time travel is a very complex subject to write about, and even more complex to get correct. And the movie does clearly try to take some attempt in explaining how it's supposed to work to start with, but then halfway through the movie they just forget to follow the rules, and no one has seemed to notice. This movie takes a lot of time to explain how the mechanics of traveling into the past are supposed to work and how you can easily screw it up, but in doing so, it ends up screwing itself majorly. And I've decided to put together a little diagram to help to illustrate to you what exactly I mean. So I've made this little diagram here to help illustrate what I mean by this. To understand why Endgame's plot doesn't make sense, we're going to explain the grandfather paradox. This is a paradox that I'm going to explain by showing time in a straight line, because that's how a timeline is supposed to work. It starts with you, right at the end, you being you, then at the middle we have your father, and then right at the beginning of the timeline we have your grandfather. Say you didn't want to exist anymore, and you gain access to time travel somehow. You use this time machine to go back in time and use this newfound ability to kill your grandfather. And since your grandfather is dead, your dad doesn't exist, and now neither do you. Seems like the problem's solved, right? Well, there's a bit of an issue. Now that you don't exist, you can't go back into the past to kill your grandfather. Which means you don't go back into the past, your grandfather doesn't die, he lives, he gives birth to your dad, and he gives birth to you, and the cycle ends up repeating itself. This is known as the grandfather paradox. Now, it's important to keep this in mind because even though the movie brings this up, it seems to forget about this with one major issue. Therefore, Endgame should not work. Once again, we're going to operate with a straight line, having the beginning point being in 2014, just at the beginning of the events of Guardians of the Galaxy, the middle point being the events of Infinity War, and the end point being 5 years in the future in 2023 with Endgame. Using Ant-Man's help, they use time travel to go back to 2014 and various other locations, but this is the important one, to gather all of the Infinity Stones to undo what Thanos did in Infinity War. The problem is, Thanos from 2014 finds out what they're doing and manipulates their time travel device to travel into the future to 2023 and fight the Avengers in the future. Now, this does sacrifice some character and whatnot, but we're gonna skip ahead of that for a second. I'll come back to it. Essentially, Thanos is defeated in the future, his snap is undone, Captain America goes into the past and returns all the Infinity Stones where they need to be in time. All is right in the world, right? Well, if you answered yes to that, then you clearly weren't paying attention. The version of Thanos they kill isn't in the future, it's in the past, in 2014. If he doesn't exist in the past, then he can't make Infinity War happen. And if he doesn't make Infinity War happen, then the events of Endgame can't possibly happen because there's no motivation to do it. They have no knowledge that they need to go into the past. Ergo, they don't go into the past. Thanos doesn't come into the future, so he doesn't get killed, which means he's able to gather all the Infinity Stones in the past, make Infinity War happen, half the population dies again. This should not work! They spent so much time trying to explain how time travel works and the rules that they have to follow, and they just up and forget halfway through the movie as if they never explained it in the first place. Now, I know some of you might argue, well, they changed the events of past, so it's now operating on an alternate timeline, right? Newsflash, that's not how time works. Time doesn't operate on two separate branches or multiple different branches like it's often illustrated. Yes, when you're mapping out the possible ways a scenario could go down, it does kind of look like a route, looks like a branch, but time operates in a single line forward, like a river. Say you go to the beginning of that river and you throw a rock right in the middle of it. You're effectively changing how the water flows all the way down the river up to a specific point where it no longer matters. It doesn't seem like much, but the changes are significant. But getting back on track, because they've changed so much about the past, certain events in the future are no longer able to happen. For example, Thanos can't necessarily drop Gamora off of a cliff to get the Soul Stones since Thanos doesn't exist in the Infinity War time anymore, which means Gamora is still technically alive in this new timeline. But what about changes back all the way to the first Avengers? Loki gets away with the Tesseract. And since he escaped, he can't necessarily be in captivity during Thor the Dark World, which is really gonna mess with the events in that movie. Or how about since Thanos is dead in 2014, he can't be alive in 2018 to kill Vision to get the Mind Stone, which means Scarlet Witch has absolutely no reason to hate Thanos considering Vision is still alive. Or how about that bit I haven't talked about yet? Captain America's ending. The surviving Avengers of Endgame sent Captain America back into the past to return all of the Infinity Stones back to the points of time they're supposed to belong to. This might be a little bit difficult considering two of them are supposed to be on completely different planets, but we're gonna overlook that for a second. Captain America returns all of the stones and then doesn't return to the present. Instead, he stays in the past, reunites with Agent Carter, and then spends the remainder of his life with her in the past. Yeah. Remember Captain America Civil War? Remember Sharon Carter? Remember how she's the great niece of Peggy Carter? Remember how Captain America in that timeline had a very close relationship with her? Now, have you stopped for a second to think that if Peggy Carter and Captain America got married in the past, that Sharon Carter would essentially become Captain America's great niece? And remember, the Russo brothers directed the second and third Captain America movies, the third of which being Civil War. So are they unintentionally implying that incest is wincest? Now, your rebuttal to that might be, well, maybe the Russo brothers didn't take that far into account. Well then, I'd argue that they didn't put nearly nearly as much thought into this time travel thing as they want everyone to believe. Especially with massive oversights like that one and all of the other ones that I've mentioned.
Well, that's an easy solution, Director. Just turn your brain off and you'll be able to enjoy these things because you won't have to think about them so much.
Oh, really? Is that the explanation you're going with? Well, if they didn't want me to think about this so much, then why did they explain the rules of time travel in the beginning of the movie? They gave me the tools to think about their premise at the beginning of the movie. If they didn't want me to think about it, why did they explain the basic fundamentals of time travel? No more. I'm just gonna have to stop the rough cut right here, because if I don't, I'm gonna lose all form of sanity. I'll just come back to this movie at some point with a full review as soon as the Russo brothers finally stop talking about parts of their movie and keep explaining things. Because the more they explain, the more irritated I get about this. In a nutshell, this was a very entertaining movie, but not a solid one in terms of plot. And because the Russo brothers and everyone in the world are praising it as better than the average story, I have to call it out for what it is, not nearly as good as that. And I hope it makes sense to you now why I hate time travel so much. And I'm giving this movie I don't know what rating I'm giving it yet. I'm gonna have to review the whole thing at some point and make up my mind then. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've gotta silently anticipate a new Spider-Man movie coming out. Maybe that movie will be a bit more kind to me in terms of continuity than—
I could use someone like you on my world.
Your world? Beck is from Earth, just not ours. The snap tore a hole in our dimension.
You're saying there's a multiverse?